This video will cover evolution theory in a bit more detail than you've seen to this point. Evolution theory is basically the idea that all living beings descended one from another through adaptations to changing climatic conditions or changing climatic environment and or through genetic mutations. That one being over a long period of time essentially evolved into another being. We'll look at the evolution theory here, and a couple of videos from this point we'll see the proof for evolution, but this will just cover the theoretical part here. The theory of evolution is, in a little bit more detail, is first of all that the first being was a single-celled being called an animalcule, and it appeared about 3.5 billion years ago. And that all plants and animals descended from that animalcule, from that first single-celled being, through great expanse of time, through mutations and adaptations. All plants and animals ultimately descended from a single one-celled animal, which is called the animalcule, but as we'll see later on in the proof for evolution video, that that single-celled being really, from the fossil evidence, was a plant. The general idea is that evolution proceeds very slowly with many small steps over a very long time period, and it is this great expanse of time which, at least in our mind's eye, can say, well, that just about anything is possible, that one being could have evolved from another because we have such a huge quantity of time, almost an unimaginably large quantity of time, 3.5 billion years for all this to have happened. And that is the reason why many people tend to believe in evolution theory, because that large time could basically result in just about anything happening. Now, another postulate of evolution theory is that the path of evolution was completely unplanned with no planned ending. It's pretty well agreed that human beings are, in some sense, in the top of the evolutionary tree, the top of the evolutionary cycle, and that we were not planned, that it's not a planned ending in our case, nor were any of the intermediate steps, the various plants and animals that theoretically evolved one from another, were not the consequence of any plan, any supreme being, any God who planned it, but just happened as a result of the environmental conditions and mutations that occurred to the genetic information, as we'll see in later videos. It is also part of the evolution theory that evolution is still in progress. It's not something that we can observe right now because the time span that we have to observe it is so short relative to 3.5 billion years that we can't really measure it, but it's believed by evolutionists that this evolution is still in progress. And finally, that, as I said already, that adaptation to environmental changes, the ice comes in and you have glaciation of the large part of the earth, and then beings adapt to be able to handle it. Some can handle it, they survive. Some cannot handle it, they die out. And also some lucky beings have a genetic mutation that allows them to get new characteristics which enables them to withstand environmental changes. So that's basically the theoretical footing, the theoretical basis, the theoretical ideas behind evolution. In a more picturesque way, the general idea is picturized here as a tree of life that the evolutionists use to explain things or to demonstrate things, starting with a single-celled being, whether it's bacteria, animal, but we now pretty well believe to be a plant cell. Started out 3.5 billion years ago. It led over a long span of time to early sea creatures, the fish, amphibians, lizards, birds, mammals, and finally humans. And so the evolutionary concept is pictured as this tree of life with a common root and all the branches that form out to form all the beings that evolved one from another in a gross sense. So that's what evolution is believed to be by evolutionists. Now, most of you hopefully have already seen the scientific method video. It consists of 5 steps. And perchance, if some of you have not seen, I'll just very, very briefly go through this. The scientific method consists of observing something, of developing a theory to explain it, and then comparing theory to all the data that one has. Initially, easy data that are gained as a result of observing something and finding any similar sorts of data. And at that point, it takes a step off into over a cliff in some sense to make predictions based upon the theory as it's known to point, and then performing tests to validate the predictions. If all works out, one stops at point 0.5, but more typically one goes through a cyclical iteration here to find data that don't agree with the initial theory, to modify the theory, and then to proceed to these steps again. That's basically the scientific method. Now, as that scientific method is applied to evolution theory, one can categorize it in this way, up to the point of predictions. We'll see in a later video what happens to these predictions, whether they're validated or not. But let's just go to this point up to the first 4 steps of evolution theory in the scientific method. First, it's observed that there's a similarity between fossilized plants and animals. When Darwin and other naturalists started gathering various plants and animals together, they noted there was somewhat of a similarity. Some plants looked like they could have just kind of at one time been in one version and then for some reason or other converted over to a new species of plant. The same for animals, that this could possibly have happened. From the study of fossils, it was concluded and observed at least that the oldest seemed to be the simplest. Those fossils from the very earliest rock structures that were deposited seemed to be the simplest animals, and that as we got to younger and younger rock strata, that the more complex animals were found entrapped. Plants also, of course, were found entrapped in these rocks as fossils. So that was kind of a basis that of initial idea that the oldest were the simplest, and the most recent animals, fossils, and of course human beings that exist in forms on Earth today are the most complex. It was also expected and observed that some types of living beings appeared for a while and they're now extinct. And that's basically observations that were based upon it. The theory, in a little more succinct way, is that all living beings descended one from another. Only the fittest survived. If there was some change in the climate or change in the living conditions on Earth, that only those that were adapted to it survived, the rest perished. And the general idea that there were very small steps in between species, very small changes that would result in a ultimate development of a new species. And at the time of Darwin, for say several decades before and several decades after, until Darwin passed away, there were a relatively small fossil and living plant and animal database was available, but it seemed to be consistent with this idea. You could observe some similarities. You could conjure up that, boy, this possibly one could have evolved one from the other. And the idea of extreme length of time led one to believe that, gee, this was a reasonable theoretical basis upon which to proceed. Darwin himself made some predictions within his On the Origin of Species book in 1859 that are still believed by evolutionists today to be things that could be used to prove it. And let me just go through what those are. First of all, the predictions that he made, the 2 main ones, were there should be very many intermediate missing link fossils. Then the small steps that happened as a result of one being transforming into another over a long period of time. There should be the death of some of the intermediate beings, such as some creatures that were halfway between fish and amphibians, for example. There should be fish with more a few amphibian-like characteristics, perhaps protuberances that lead to feet and other characteristics, lungs and various other characteristics that are known to exist in amphibians. And one should be able to find fossils. And Darwin himself thought that there should be an extremely large number of these intermediate missing link fossils found. He was just figured it was a matter of time until geologists got their act together and determined where to look for these various fossilized intermediate or missing link beings. So that was the first prediction, that there should be a lot of these missing link fossils, and you probably have an inkling already and seen, if you've seen some of the prior tapes, that really none have been found to date. Darwin also spent a great bit of time, several chapters in his book, talking about, worrying about, and thinking about complex parts of beings, and He realized that with his slow, methodical, small step business for the evolution of one living species into another living species, that it wouldn't do to have a very complex part of a new species that took a very long time to come together and be as part of that species. In other words, if a thing like an eyeball took a very long time to develop before it could be useful to the new being with the eyeball to be able to see prey or see problems ahead in its life, uh, that could not happen by very slow steps, according to the survival of the fittest concept of evolution theory, because as that eye, and an example here, was developed partially but still useless for any good purpose for the animal gaining that eye, it would just drop out of the evolution of that animal because it was useless. It would not be passed on to future generations because it's not a useful tool until it's complete. So Darwin spent a great deal of time talking about and hoping that complex organs would not be found because they would, in his verbiage, would invalidate his model. In the scientific method, it would require, if such complex beings were found, it would require a rather drastic modification of evolution theory, and we'll see that later on. So for evolution theory, there is a future plan. It has been ongoing for about the last 150 plus years. And its number one is to continue the search by paleontologists and geologists for these missing link fossils to prove that evolution theory is true. This would be a form of positive proof to find these fossils. And again, these missing link fossils can be between any species, any similar species. For example, I use the example of fish to amphibian, but the evolutionists believe that chimpanzees are the earliest ancestors of humans, and so therefore there should be some fossilized remains found between a chimpanzee and a human, say a quarter of the way, half the way, three-quarters of the way, or at least uh, variations of chimpanzees that lead to the characteristics that we ultimately see in humans. So that is the primary thing I think I would say that evolution is concerned about, is to find these missing link fossils, because that is positive proof. There also is some effort ongoing to explain these complex organs that have been found, such as a living human cell, DNA, and other complex parts of living beings that we'll discuss in later videos. And other scientific areas are being pulled into the evolution side of things to try to explain how these things could have developed without being useless and have developed over long periods of time. And so far there hasn't really been any success in that area, but that is being investigated. Various other scientific areas are being incorporated in the evolution search, such as the physicists, cosmologists, paleontologists, those who look for fossils, geneticists, those who look at the characteristics of DNA and how these modifications in DNA can change the characteristics of living beings, cell biologists, botanists, and a whole host of other disciplines in the scientific realm have been enlisted to look at various other aspects of life so as to lead to an understanding of the origin of life from the viewpoint of evolution theory. And well, I haven't mentioned this to date, but I think the real driving force behind evolution and what I've read and what I've understood about it, in order to keep searching for this proof, the reasons are very much based upon the fact that it is felt by evolutionists that this is the only realistic explanation for the existence of life on Earth. This is a belief that the scientific area and the evolution concept, evolution theory, is the only real explanation for life on Earth, and that the only other competitor that evolution theory has, that of biblical creation, is obviously untrue. That, I believe, is what they feel is true, and therefore, if you are in a position where you feel like you have the one and only possible theory, and your only competing theory is impossible, that's why you pursue so heatedly and so strongly this area of evolution theory. I'll show you in subsequent videos that I think this is where they make their big mistake, that it is not without competition. Evolution theory is unproven, and it really truly does have competition, and that competition has been increasing in amount and importance and intensity in the recent years. And I'll point out some of that to you so that you can see too that biblical creation really has a strong scientific support for the history that it reports. But in any event, this is what I wanted to cover on evolution theory, what it is, where it's going.